session is supposed to focus on 5 essays, 5 ideas: innovation, legitimacy, mortality, nesting, and risk. And try to hope to understand maybe some common themes between those 5 ideas and some outliers where those are very unique, I think, in their own way. So I'm going to start by looking at 2 essays specifically, David and Allison's. In some way, they seem to address their respective topics through this idea of fear in a lot of ways. It came up in both essays a lot. So David, I want to pick on you first, but you mentioned, and I'm quoting you here, instead of the failure being a standalone result of an experiment or simply just part of a greater process, failure and the fear of it becomes part of who we are. So what role do you think fear plays when we understand innovation, and why are we so eager to self-identify with our own fear and failure?
I think that we tie up our value in fear. And so I was trying to think back and I couldn't remember the timing of when I wrote the essay of like what was going on in life of like,
Wow.
yeah. But I think it was right after, or like right before we launched Cass Gardens. And just the energy and excitement. And I mean, there's more national, international exposure to hydroponics and everything. And I was just like, man, this is going to be it. This is going to be the key that unlocks, nonprofit entrepreneurism, and we fell flat on our face, and it hurt. It hurt bad. And it was interesting kind of reading my own essay, being like, okay, like, because for a while there, like I tied up my own self-worth in that experiment. And so it's tough because we find ourselves in a society and we find ourselves in jobs that performance matters, right? And so how do you create that space as an employer, or even as an employee, that you can try things that don't work out and still believe that, hey, it is what it is, that market conditions or the community that we find ourselves in, that just because it didn't work out this way this time doesn't mean that it won't work out this way next time or something like that. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
Allison, you said the real result of risk is innovation. And that's a bold sentence with a period at the end of it. How do those 2 things work in your mind, or how are they misunderstood? Maybe is a better question.
I mean, I think, I don't know, to me, they're intertwined, right? Like you can't innovate, you can't learn from your mistakes unless you take the risk to do it in the first place. And I think we find ourselves often, especially in this community, not even wanting to try and not even wanting to like put a step forward and try something new because of that fear, because of the personal ego that kind of goes along with it, right? Because every project that you do, like you are personally wrapped up in that, right? Like there is a piece of you, like for every project I've ever done, there's a piece of me in that along the way, right? And so if that fails, what does that say about you? But then if it succeeds, right, then the ultimate reward, right? You created something new, you have innovated, you have sort of changed the landscape moving forward, even if the product that you created, even if it succeeds and then it fails, right? Because sometimes that can happen too. Right. So I think it's that process of like proving not just to yourself, but to the community that you have to try. And when you try, you can succeed and you can create lasting change or lasting marks, even if that thing doesn't work out in the end. Does that make sense?
Is there such a thing as good failure and bad failure?
That's a tricky question. I don't know. I mean, I think probably. I mean, I think
feels
so.
like it. I mean,
Yeah.
when people make the claim that our community is less tolerant of failure than others, it assumes that there's, at least in the broad perspective of your reputation and identity, there's good versions and bad versions of failing, and I don't know, failure and innovation are mutually exclusive. You can fail beautifully, I suppose. But I guess the real question is, what does that do not only to the progress you're trying to make or add value to, but what does it do for your personal reputation? At the end of the day, that's, I think, what we're talking about when we talk about things like risk. I'm risking my perceived value, my reputation, my brand.
I think that, in at least in our subgroup, we deal with people, and so there's less, in some ways, there's less risk tolerance in the human services, nonprofit, those different roles, as opposed to software design. People, it's like people aren't willing to rock the boat because there are lives at stake. For Leslie to come out with I'm making this up, a new therapy for hospice patients. If this thing doesn't work out, I guess everyone in hospice is going to die anyway, but like that's, well, I mean, like we're all going that way, but that it could significantly impact the end of life transition for people and their families. Like, hey, let's just go tried and true. If somebody else wants to try it, like, that's fine. We're going to let them do the experiment, and then we'll catch on the backside, kind of thing.
Zach, it feels like our definition of good or bad failure would be relevant or related to how we're defining success. So, right, you can't fail horribly if success is a bar here, or, what is that measurement? And that seems like it's going to affect our definition of failure.
Well, and okay, I'll pick on you then. What there also seems to be some sense of need, if we're serious about a claim like innovation as a result of risk, that risk and that innovation has to be legitimized by others. And this idea of legitimizing it, I think, is a different way to come to this idea of perception and risk and value and brand. Is it a failure? Well, it depends on how you classify the failure and who's the one making the classification.
Right.
So how does failure intersect with legitimacy?
I mean, I think everything can intersect with legitimacy, right? And I think it, to bring your essay in a bit around the community, like who's legitimizing it, who is forming that opinion. I think legitimacy comes from the individual who's offering that, and if it's viewed with credibility, but then also kind of the en masse, if it's a large group of people offering that legitimacy. And I think it also then lies in the beholder of who's receiving that, and are they going to validate that as legitimate, right? So the group of us could all have the audacity to take risk and put in the effort and say this, but at the end of the day, that success or failure is going to be measured by the people viewing that, not just those who are participating.
Is it healthier to legitimize an idea or a person?
Ooh. I mean, that's pretty philosophical, Zach. I would say
thought these were supposed to be softball questions. Come on.
It's Monday morning, man. Just let warm up a little bit.
I feel like it's the person. And I feel like this goes back to, is it a proverb? If you teach a man to fish, because if you legitimize the person, I really believe that we as individuals have unlimited potential, right? If I legitimize an idea that feels singular and limited in some space or time, I think
The reason
legitimizing
I
the
ask
person.
is I think oftentimes someone will say, oh, that was a good idea. But when you fail, it's like, oh, he or she failed.
Oh,
Like,
good point.
it doesn't seem like it works. It doesn't play by the same rules going each way.
Well, and I like to bring it on a personal level. What's, and I see it both ways. Like, so, I transitioned out of CAS. If success was based just off of my involvement, then the project failed. Right. But the project is the mission of the organization is far beyond one person, and the need is far beyond one person. And so what's funny is, like, I hope the legitimacy is behind the project and not the person, because there will be leadership transition. So I want the legitimacy to be behind the project and not just one person. That being said, projects are made up of people, and so, like, it's a both and. But, like, my initial thought was, oh, I want it to be the person, and then I was like, wait a second, actually, we're flawed people that, and we can have good seasons and bad seasons of life, and so it's like, yeah, I don't know. Even as I was hearing you talk, Heather, I was like, I think it could go either way. So
I think it evolves. I think a project evolves. I think when something starts out as an idea, the perfect marriage is when it's with the right person and the right idea, and then it's legitimized by the right people. Because I just thinking about healing arts program, right? So there were multiple times in that project where I was asked by music therapists and other, like, artist therapists, well, we've tried to do this in the past. Why is this working? How are you able to do this? How are you able to get this through? We have tried this for years and this hasn't worked. And my answer was, I don't know. Right place, right time, right people. Like, I don't know why it worked now and it didn't work 5, 10, 15 years ago. So I think, but then you get it to a point where it sort of launches, and like, as Heather was saying, a collective legitimizes it. And once you get that sort of over that hump, or the flywheel goes, then it's on its own. And then I think you can remove yourself as the person, because then the project has its own identity and its own brand and its own life.
So this discussion, this group wasn't curated specific for a topic, but there is a lot of overlaps between these essays.
We're also good looking, and
right. No, there's totally that too.
We just need to throw that out there, Zach. So.
I thought I went without saying, but you're right. You're completely right. I think at face value, even an essay like Leslie's, who's on mortality, in some ways is also about risk, innovation, decision-making for sure, and trying to legitimize something that in a lot of ways, I think people struggle coming to grips with. So Leslie, tell us a little bit about that journey and what that's like to help people think through those things when they know the end is near. Time is limited.
Yeah, for sure. I think that what I've realized throughout my career is that, and I think we all know this, is there's so many different beliefs and thoughts around end of life or healthcare or mortality in general. And so when you're talking to people, you are coming from a ground zero, you don't know where their belief lies. And so there's a lot of risk of putting yourself out there and navigating through those conversations and understanding that you may be jumping into something that you have no idea. So the risk associated with jumping into a conversation and not knowing where you're going to land at the end, and also keeping yourself in check that my beliefs may be very different than this person's belief. I have spent most of my career working at end of life, so I personally have very strong opinions about how I've seen it done well and how I've seen it not done well. But I also think understanding that everyone's beliefs are very different, and how you could lead somebody down a path that is not authentic and genuine to that person or that person's families or beliefs. Not just talking about religious beliefs or it's social beliefs, it's fear of dying ultimately, of how do I facilitate that conversation to lessen the fear of what's coming next without having maybe a belief to hold on to of what is next. So I think there's a lot of that. And I also think just getting into the heart of just really understand, I guess, that whole journey of where people land in life, and what landed them there is where how comfortable they are with what ending well potentially.
You talked a little bit about in that journey trying to understand kind of the mission of yourself, your life, which I thought was a beautiful way to kind of explain what that conversation feels like to have with others. But in some ways, it came across, at least to me, like, if we can solidify that, we can legitimize this mission. There is an inherent peace that's brought with that, a peace that you probably woefully need in those last few days, months. How important is identifying? Has it changed how you think about yourself and understanding what that mission is for people that aren't necessarily forced to have that discussion with themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's been actually more clear to me in the last couple of years than it has been. And even though I've been working at the end of life most of my career, I think one thing that's really become important to me is we did in 2020, our organization went through a strategic planning exercise, which I have been through several times before this time. And I think that the thing that really started when I was looking at it through the lens of how are we serving people at end of life, which is the first time I've done it with this organization, I really looked at I talk about it in my essay, but my own personal mission and my own personal set of values. And why is this, kind of getting into this realm of life where a lot of people aren't comfortable, physicians, healthcare people, but just in general, you're not comfortable sitting around a kitchen table and talking about this maybe with your family. So I think what it really identified for me this last time in 2020, we were in the heart of COVID. We were in the heart of stay at home order. And we were saying I'm like, what's the purpose? What are we doing? And that's not identified through my career or it's identified through the people that I was closest to during that point of time, and saying, how am I going to change? We got a lot of opportunity out of that to say, how are we going to live differently coming out of this? That we realize all the things that weren't important to us, and we realize all the things that were unnecessary, the busyness specifically I was creating in my own life, of joining everything, being part of things, wanting to make sure I wasn't, that I was keeping myself involved so I could stay, I don't know, maybe, and I've really reflected on this with talking about my mission, is like my own relevance, like what was the reason I was doing all of this? And I really saw in my own life, a switch, and processing through this essay was really helpful for me, because I thought, what is my mission? What is my purpose? And I've seen, and I mentioned this in my essay, I've seen somebody do this really well and saying, my mission is to tell others, as I am dying, as I'm going through this really terrible end of life journey, I'm going to turn this around and say how I can impact other people. And so I have an opportunity in my role and the work our organization is doing to impact people. And how can I come to peace with my own internal values and my own internal mission to make sure that I, at the end of my life, feel like I'm not having regrets, and I'm not going back and saying all that busyness was for what, and I think a lot of things came together in this last 2 years to really be able to reflect upon that.
Leslie, I don't know if there's a question in here, but it's more of the mission discussion was did kind of catch my attention a little bit, kind of with the concept of you can't have multiple priorities. You can have a priority, like that's it, right? You may have a list of things to do, but when you force rank things, there's one thing at the top, and that's it. And I felt that, on a personal side, it's like, what is my mission? And it's again, on a very personal level, it was for a long time there, I was not a good husband and father because my mission was my organization. And that was something that that was not forced on me, that was chosen by me. And, earlier this year was the wake up call of like, all right, that competition, I can't continue that anymore. And so, I don't know. My original thought was, or my original question reading was, what do you do when you have competing missions or competing priorities? And I was like, oh, you leave your job and spend more time with your family. That's at least that's what I ended up doing. So, but to that point, but it's at the same time, it doesn't delegitimize what was being done, but it was, just recognizing, what is that mission? What is that priority?
And it's interesting because can your mission, and I think one of the things I struggled with during that time was, and continue to struggle with, is competing priorities is one thing. Can my mission override everything else in my life? That I'm not as, can I be, if I'm focusing on my mission, what I'm trying to accomplish, maybe the busyness of what it takes to do my role every day, or my busyness is what it takes to be a mom and a wife and all those things. How can that pair together and make sure that I am honoring what is important to me? And at the point when it's not honoring that, what do I need to do to change that and refocus? I mean, just kind of mission realignment all the time personally as well. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, David. I think you saw it firsthand going through, what's happened over the last several months, year, right? I mean, just seeing that in your own personal life and saying, you have to recognize when you're not in alignment with what you ultimately, and you have to take that time to reflect and say, what is important to my life?
Yeah. And
I'm not good at that either. I'm not the expert on this, but I think that it's been a good exercise for me to continue to do.
And I think the fear or the uncomfortableness that people have around talking about death is the finiteness of it, right? And I think when we get comfortable in that place of uncomfortableness and understand, like, we literally have only so many minutes and hours in a day, right? So, like, yes, end of life, but also end of day. And at the end of the day, if we just think about that finiteness, it allows us to, there's like power in being able to say what I'm saying yes to, versus the fear of what I might have to let go of. And so I think it allows us to have that clarity of, this is what I'm choosing, and this is what I'm going to legitimize and say yes to, and how I'm going to spend my time and focus, even if it's a couple of things. But the freedom of letting go of those things that aren't serving us anymore.
Heather, do you know the book Essentialism?
I have skimmed it. I have not read it.
Yeah, no, it's I think I'm in the same boat there. But the premise of every time that you say yes to one thing, you are saying no to an infinite number of other possibilities. And I think that's that legitimizing piece of, this is, if I say yes, like, I'm saying no to everything else. And do I really want to legitimize this thing, whatever this is in my life, because I'm saying no to everything else?
Yeah.
And I think, then mortality just puts that front and center, because it's like, I don't know when this is going to happen, whether this is, 3 days later or 3 months or 3 years. But when there's that terminal diagnosis, it's like, it's coming.
Well, and I think there is, whether it's admitted or not, largely an inherent sense of failure. I ran out of time. I didn't get to do what I thought I was going to get done while I was here. And that's what I don't want to come to grips with is, I thought I had more time. I planned on doing more. I just didn't get to it. The other common theme in all of these was some mention, whether implicit or not, of positions of power. Allison said it outright. The others hinted at it. But it's be interesting to see what you think relative to your own idea that you know, your essay, but what role these power structures play and how do you see them helping, hindering, like what does that look like? I don't think anybody here would argue they don't exist, I guess is my first point, but Allison, you're the one that started this.
What's the question again? Repeat the question.
Well, you spend some real estate in your essay talking about the how positions of power can hinder our appetite for risk, and who those people are and how they get there. And there's also, I think, a reference to Tupperware in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about that as it relates to risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all at risk for sort of homogenizing ourselves, like making ourselves in the same group and finding ourselves with the same people. And I mean, sometimes we do that on purpose, right? Like I've very much curated my social media to be everyone who thinks like me, because I just don't have brain space to like fight with people virtually. So so I think that's just inherent. I think it kind of lends itself to a little bit to your essay, Zach, in that we find ourselves in these groups of people at times, you know, oftentimes intentionally or not, who think and act and are like us. And so it takes intentionality as someone who's in a position of influence. I wouldn't even say power, because oftentimes, yeah, you don't necessarily have to have power to be influential. But as people of influence, there is a responsibility you have to assume in being really intentional of bringing other people along who don't think and look and act and are like you, especially the thinking part. I think we get really hung up on people that look like us. And yes, that's important, absolutely. However, it's really important to make sure we're finding people that don't have our same lived experiences in order to shape the outcomes of your innovation or your risk or your project or whatever those things are. I distinctly remember working on a middle wave, and there was a meeting that we had. We were probably, I don't know, 4 months out from the first festival, and one of the steering committee members was very risk averse, and he was asking all of these questions and, you know, getting really in the weeds. And I remember like pounding on the table and just saying like, my blood pressure is so high right now, like I can't handle it. Why are we talking about this? We have to move forward. We have to make this. And I, reflecting on that, if everyone would have been like me, we would have been in a heap of trouble. Like, we needed him to be asking those questions. And I think I learned that a lot in the current organization I'm in. You know, we have a lot of people that are very front facing and very relationship oriented and very, you know, ready to move at the next project. And then we have a whole other group of people that are very wanting to know the details and wanting to be really in the weeds of things, which is also very important, right? And so you have to have all of those things.
Allison, I think that's a really good example. I think I was thinking back to healing arts. So like, I think when we hear power structure, we all get a little like itchy. I don't think anybody loves to think of like, quote unquote, the man, right? And I think even the collection of essays, we all want to like push against maybe assumed power structure. So I really like the word influence. I think it's just as important for people with influence to legitimize those with the ideas who are willing to take risk and put in the work. David, to your essay, But I also think it's important for everyone with the ideas and who are willing to work to like step up to engage those with influence, right? Like I think we each have responsibility to be a part of that equation. It's like Allison and I, you know, I think if there was a missing essay from this book, it would be, and Zach, you know, to your point, who knew what people were going to write about? But like Dan Swartz on Audacity. Like Dan had the audacity to connect Allison and I because he thought there would be a benefit there. And, you know, a communications professional and Allison with her experience in dance and nonprofits, who were we to start something and move that forward? But, you know, through that process, we were doing Tai Chi at the bedside of pediatric cancer patients and dance with Parkinson's patients. Like, what? Who said we could do that? And so, but somebody who had influence or quote unquote power said yes, and we stepped into that and just said, yeah, we can do this. And so I think there's like both sides of that equation. I think people hear power structure and it's like, oh, yuck. But also it's an opportunity to, you know, leverage ideas and the collective group of people who could have that influence. And I, you know, think if it's used for good, it's not a bad thing.
I think so much of it goes back to ego. I mean, really, truly, it's so much of it goes back to ego and being able to set your own ego aside to be able to listen, respect, legitimize, honor other people, period. And know that that doesn't take away, just because you have given that to someone else doesn't mean it takes away from you.
I'm going to push back. So I'll concede that persons of influence feels better. It doesn't dissolve the reality that there are structural systemic powers that be. I don't think your Tai Chi experiment at the time probably felt like an experiment. Feels nearly as legitimized if it's not done for Parkview. Right? So
Right. Yep.
how do these people of influence navigate power structures, I think, is a legitimate discussion. You know, I don't know, north of probably 80% of Leslie's patients will say, I'd rather die at home than in a hospital. If you ask them why, they really can't articulate that, except for the fact that I don't want the man dealing with me or having to make decisions for me at that time, at that moment. And it's an allergic reaction to that power structure. So when I hear essays about risk and innovation and failure, legitimacy, it's one thing to say we're going to do it on an individual by individual basis. I think it's another to say we have to figure out how to tackle this and not be scared of understanding how to maneuver through power structures in some way or redefine them. But I don't think they disappear.
I wrote about failure at one point, and I think it was, I forget the publication, and the pushback was that failure is acceptable when you're in a position of privilege. And as a white guy in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as you know, that I'd been given legitimacy through these, you know, whether it was earned or not, I received legitimacy because of these different networks. And, you know, Zach gets me connected to this person, or, you know, I get introduced to Zach from a board member, and then Zach introduces me to this person, that person introduces me to that person. And all along the way, kind of this trail of legitimacy. But, you know, it goes back to, do I get that first meeting if I'm a Black woman? And, you know, one thing through 2020 of like really struggling with, like, do I need to be in the room? Like, am I the right person to even be in the room? And balancing, I don't think that's the right word, but recognizing that there also may be a idea vacuum, right? So it's like, if I want to be there because I want to have influence, or I'm interested in this thing, I want to be involved in it, but at the same time, like, if I'm involved in everything, like, is that the right spot for me to be in? And is my seat being taken by me when somebody else deserves to be there? And I mean, that in concept was something that, starting in all 2020 before that, but I mean, just with the emphasis of 2020, the summer of 2020, that was something that began that I personally have not come to a resolution to. I don't know if there is a resolution to it, but it's just kind of an ongoing discussion, struggle, something. So
I fully agree. I feel like it's a really terrible feeling when you're in a room in a really important discussion and you know that there are other people that should be in the room that are not a part of the discussion, on purpose or unintentionally. And also not knowing who those people should be. Does that make sense? Like, knowing that you're not, the right people aren't in the room, but you also don't know who the right people are. and I feel like that's kind of where I feel like I'm stuck right now a little bit in certain areas. I feel like our community is stuck in certain areas, right? And so we look at the same 5 people because that's who we know and who have presented themselves, and but they're not the right people either, and they're telling us they're not the right. They're saying, I'm not the right person. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Does this come back to the point around ego and, even around the idea of community? Like, I think sometimes there's ego that prevents the legitimacy, from the people being included into the room. But I think there could be people outside of the room who are like, I don't need to be a part of that because I can do this. And they're like, their ego prevents them from walking in the room. And I think, the opportunity with, the messages in Forthcoming, I think, is to have this collective consciousness to say, we want better for our community, and we all need to kind of agree on these kind of ground rules that could make us, better as a community. And I think if we do that, if we operate in that way, then, and everybody lets go of the ego and everybody kind of raises their hand for the things that they want to participate in, and the people with current influence who are willing to share that and extend that to others are, welcoming people into the room and into the conversation. That's the ideal state, right? That we're doing that together.
I feel like that shows up a bit in something. I was looking back at the titles. One thing that's not explicitly mentioned in the title is trust. And I feel like I always go back to, we did a study, a CDFI study 2 years ago, national. They do this across the country. They interview people in the community and then look at our aptitude for more CDFIs and what we need. And the thing he came back with, that he said, our number one finding that we found for your community, and we have never seen this in any other community, is your level of trust. No one trusts each other in your community. And that's cross-sector, within organizations, across organizations.
Who said this?
And Mark Pinsky, the CDFI America. So yeah, that was a real light bulb for Brad and I. And having that knowledge and then seeing other things play out, we've been like, whoa, that's a real thing. That is a real thing.
Allison, were there any root cause of why through their interviews, they didn't see that? The Midwest is nice, is that what it is? I mean, is that why the trust isn't there? Is we talk about that, like the nice culture and how that might impact trust, is everyone so kind to each other? Is that what it is? I mean, I don't know where it'd be interesting to know where that's coming from.
I mean, I think in the nonprofit space, we see it play out all the time, right? I mean, I don't trust your idea. I have something similar in mind, but I'm going to go start my own thing because my idea is better, instead of trusting you and your idea and my idea in your hands.
Right. You know, when we talk about, I know, just to circle back to the power concept, I think, you know, we're talking on a macro scale in a way. Mine's more on a micro scale of what I talk about from a power perspective. But I think it kind of goes along with all of it anyway, is that do I trust that I've made the right decisions for myself? Do I trust that I have all the knowledge I need to be able to make a decision at end of life? But I also think it is a larger conversation about, I'm going to switch a little bit from power to trust here, is that trust of the medical community, trust of the larger systems. Do I see the people that are the decision makers in deciding how my decisions are going to be made for me? Or when do they stop treatments? What kind of is because of my socioeconomic class, because of my race, because of my gender identity? What kind of things are playing into those decisions of how we treat patients in general? And I think having some real awareness around that on a macro scale, how it's affecting end of life decisions or just healthcare decisions on a micro scale.
I think they're intertwined, the power structures and trust, right? Because if I'm asked to put my ego aside and legitimize you, I have to trust you first. I have to know that I trust that my legitimacy is going to you, and I'm giving up my ego to you, and I got to trust that you're going to do good with that, and you're not going to squander it and go haywire on me.
So I had this thought over the weekend, and it's interesting. So this Fort Wayne's or Northeast Indiana as a whole, like there is such a huge benefit that I forget who wrote about. It's not 7 degrees of separation. It's 2, right? It's like it really is one phone call away. Like when you can get literally a hold of anybody within 2 people, like that's such a incredible opportunity. And the over the weekend we went to one of the Chicago zoos, that's 250 acres big, and it's like, we're never going to run into anyone that we know, kind of thing, right? Versus go to the Fort Wayne Zoo, it's like I'm going to put money on the fact that I'm going to run into 3 people that I'll say hi to and all that. And so how do you balance, if this trust, if everybody knows each other and that's an established reality, but if there is an underlying explicit or implicit untrustworthiness, I don't know, what a conflict. I mean, that's some deep stuff right there.
Well, and I also think it has something, you can't imagine it doesn't have something to do with the minuscule margin of error failure has. All of social media, the entire news organization, pick your channel, is really nothing more than the glorification of fear and failure. Because it's hard to say nothing bad happened today, right? Bad things are episodic events, so it's easy to report on. But when nothing happens, you don't say it's a good day, nothing happened. Like that would never be on the news, right? So it's easy to, in small sound bites, at the macro and micro scale, I think, articulate or communicate to others, somebody failed, something bad happened. Because to say something's good means you have to clarify it and explain why it's good, and failure is just failure. So in an intellectual economy like we are now, when you legitimize someone, I think most people perceive that as trust them, they won't let you down. And that's probably not the message that should be conducive to that legitimacy. It's, oh no, this person will do as good as anyone in solving your problem. They still might fail, but this is the best person for that problem. That's different than saying, here's a person that won't let you down. And then because we don't, I think, explain it in those terms, or the culture of these discussions don't embrace that notion, all of these become these really, I think, stressful moments of, gosh, I hope that person I recommended doesn't fail, because then they're going to look at me like I'm a failure, right? And then I don't trust. Then that the whole thing, multiplies exponentially. But we always hear at our office try to talk about, when you go to the Hall of Fame for batting 300, like no one's expecting it to hit every ball, but we also have to communicate to our clients that they have some sense of confidence in us, that we might fall, we might trip, but no one's going to think through this more thoughtfully than we will. And if we can figure out, maybe no one could, I don't know, but that's not failure. That's just the best we could do. And if you're sincere with that intent, I think that idea of trust and failure is different. But I don't hear that a lot when someone recommends to me, oh, call this person, or you should have this person on your board. And I ask why, and they say, oh, they're real smart. And, well, I don't know what that means. Tell me what problems they're interested in talking through or helping work through. And then I know what that voice or that worldview or that perspective is coming from. But it really does, I think, help, Allison, to your point, kind of cultivate this necessity to not trust people, because you have so much on the line if they have a single misstep.
Well, and if we think about it in reverse, right? If I'm going back to my scenario of sitting in the room knowing I'm not the right person in the room, or the right people aren't in the room, the people who should be in the room may often not trust the other people who are in the room. Right? And so it goes both directions in that level of trust and what's needed in order to really move something forward.
And all those business books on the speed of trust, you never see one written on the speed of suspicion. It works both ways when you're dealing with small networks of people like this. Like if I see someone at the zoo on a Friday afternoon, I'm thinking, are they on vacation or are they just not work? Right? And you're automatically, because you see these people in casual settings like that, it just changes things.
And yet you're not questioning why you're at the zoo.
No, why would I? I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm here. That's just how the human brain works. It's a good and a bad. There's a pros and cons of being such a large, small town. It's easy to build a reputation. It's very quick. You can get access to people and get legitimized right out of the gate. You could be 23 and go have a lunch with the mayor. Like that doesn't happen in other cities. But for that same reason, if people don't really have a mature understanding of failure, those reputations can crumble quickly. And
Zach,
so
I want to add a footnote to my article now on legitimacy. And I think it needs to be defined more fully based on this conversation, to say, when we're legitimizing someone, we're saying they're full of potential, I think, right? And I think the immediate definition of that is the success side of potential. But to this conversation, it's also that there's full of potential for failure as well. But I'm just saying this person has full potential for one success, multiple successes, and even failure as well.
David, you won the award for my favorite quote in the book. Everyone wants to save the earth, but no one wants to help mom with the dishes.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that might be what we're talking about. When you have these discussions of legitimizing someone or something or a process, even the work Leslie's doing, you kind of talk about it like you're saving the earth. Very rarely, like to Leslie's point, everyone wants to save the earth, but no one wants to write a health directive. Right?
Or I mean, no one wants to go in a nursing home, but there's a reason why that market exists, because people don't want their lives disrupted, right? Like I don't want my parents moving in with me. So that's why the nursing home exists, right? So it's like there's an element of markets respond based off of demand, and it's like if this is where the demand is, then something's going to fill that void. But it's dirty work. It's, death is dirty work, and fundraising is dirty work. There's dirty in the sense of like, you've got but it's based off of relationships, and relationships are based off people, and people are dirty. So that's, all right. I need a drink. Is it 5 o'clock yet?
I don't think I agree with this, but I want to ask it anyway.
Yeah.
When that sentiment, I think, is interesting. Everyone wants to save the earth, no one wants to do the dishes. One way to hear that is everyone wants to talk about doing good stuff, but no one wants to work. I don't think that's all what Allison's saying when she's saying the wrong people are in the room, and if they would just work harder, they'd get in this room.
Right.
I mean, that's
correct.
You hear that a lot too.
Right.
But I also think that there's not a lot of people explaining how to wash dishes. And there's a difference there, like communicating and articulating how people of influence, power structures, whatever we're calling them for this conversation, very clearly articulate how they think dishes should be done. You can disagree, but at least you know how I'm valuing putting in the work, getting your hands dirty, whatever you want to call it, as opposed to judging you quietly and then waiting till you leave to decide whether or not you're talented or smart or should be legitimized. And I think a lot of that, I think we've done more interesting things systemically. GFW has done some things on entrepreneurism and training and support, but I'm talking more just culturally as a thought leader or a person that wants to help. I don't see a lot of that discussion around lessons learned on dishwashing.
Yeah, and I to your point, I think it can be interpreted a couple different ways. What I meant it and what I've always understood it to be is like I'm a person that likes to live in the clouds and live in idea land, and it's going to be perfect, and it's going to be great. It may not be perfect. And then it's like, no, there's the nuts and bolts. Like, how is this thing actually going to work? And am I willing to do that work to get those results? And, what I found, it's like, no, I actually don't value that thing as much as I thought I did, because I'm not willing to put in the work.
Is that a discussion, Allison, that deserves to be had when we talk about risk? Or is it not fair? Is it not fair to differentiate people in the clouds versus those that do dishes? And it's interesting from like a grant standpoint, not you, but others will say, well, we gave you money, now prove to us how many dishes you washed, right? And how many people it took to wash the dishes, and how much was the soap, and could you have bought cheaper soap? And there's all these kind of objective data points to that. But at the same time, there's not a lot of people legitimizing the intersection between that activity and people that are thinking through how to save the earth, right? The bigger picture. It seems like it's binary. It's either we're having this discussion or that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, you really have to have both, I think. Like with the Women's Fund, we're kind of figuring out how to get our community to understand systems change, which is not necessarily washing the dishes, right? But I always liken it, we always quote, I think it's Desmond Tutu, that says something like, how can we keep pulling the babies out of the river without figuring out why the babies are in the river in the first place, right? And so we always say you have to have both. You have to have organizations, groups that are doing the thing, that are, I use the example, Paula Hughes is working at the Y, which is helping women in domestic violence situations every single day. And that is absolutely needed and necessary. However, we have to figure out why why domestic violence is so high in our community in the first place. And they don't have time to do that. And admittedly, we've had, so I think you have to have processes in place to fix the larger macro idea problems, as well as the action-oriented organizations that are doing the work.
And there's value in both.
Yeah.
Right. And potentially like playing to strengths, right? But there are some times when we have to operate in our weakness as well. So like, David, your strengths might be the ideas and, you know, the 60,000 square feet, not even 30. But at some point, like, you also have to know you're going to put on the rubber gloves and do the dishes, because that might just be the work that needs to be done.
Well, and frankly, historically, my best ideas have come doing the dishes, right? And so it's like, it's trying to get that balance of, you know, Zach, you may have meeting after meeting after meeting, board meeting, but you know, your best ideas might come from actually doing the CAD work. And it's recognizing like, no, or yes, your skill sets, your personality, your position within the organization may lead you to doing 80% of this external work. But it's really that 20% that really feeds you, even though it's beneath you. That's where the your growth happens, kind of thing. And so it's you know, going back to that ego discussion of like, oh, that's beneath me. It's like, no, like get back in the kitchen. Like no one's beyond.
And even from, not from an internal perspective, but from the external, right? Those people doing that work are not below me either, right? This is like a both and. In an ecosystem, you very clearly need all of the things to happen. And so whether you're doing it today or on tomorrow, you know, like, it's all equally important to the bigger goals, and there's value inherent in all of it.
And I think we can often get out of, well, not often, we can get out of balance, right? So there are circumstances or there are situations, we all know people who will say, yeah, all these things, these are great, these are ideas. And you say, can you connect me with that person? And then it never happens, right? Or whatever the situation is, right? The follow through, the action, the thing that you need to actually happen doesn't happen. And so I think making sure that you're aware of those things and are doing things to mitigate that, right? Because you want those idea people, you want the people who can create and innovate and do those things, but also, and either they're willing to get their hands dirty and do the dishes, or they're willing to legitimize other people to do that alongside them.
Do you think it's a problem that we, and I don't mean we as in Freud, I think we as in human species maybe, don't differentiate success or achievement with our influence on what could have happened? That's a sloppy way to ask that. I'll pick on Paula at YWCA, for example. You could argue she's doing too much, not enough, pick your poison, on reducing domestic violence in our community. And people will judge it by the results. We never tend to have conversations around those types of services, Leslie's included, to say, well, what would happen if it was a different person, right? The result might be completely different, but we'd then be just judging it as isolated results again, where that individual, that person I'm legitimizing, you wouldn't believe how this would have changed if they weren't in that position of influence. I don't think people get the same care at Stillwater without Leslie there, for a lot of reasons. If she wasn't there and we never knew Leslie existed, we'd still have a conversation about Stillwater and what they're doing and how great they are. Wouldn't have been any different. We wouldn't have known better. But when we talk about this legitimacy and risk and innovation and all these things, it feels like we don't have a lot of conversations about trying to empathize or understand how this individual is approaching these problems in a very unique way that maybe is better suited, their skill set is better suited than anyone else to do this, whether or not they're succeeding or failing. And likely doesn't happen because it's hard to have those conversations. But I think too often we don't have those conversations, especially when we're talking about how good of a job we think someone's doing, is not understanding all the plates that they're spinning in the air while trying to save the world and do the dishes.
I think that you have a really good point there, because I think that there's a leader, a person for every season of let's just use it from an organization standpoint. So there's a time when the organization really needs to grow and they need this innovative idea person, and things need to be a little bit different because of what the environment's calling for, what is happening in the nature of that type, or what's happening with domestic violence, what's going on, what's the different trends we're seeing, and you need somebody really innovative in that. And then I do think that there's a season that changes, and you need a lot of people that are in the weeds, doing the dishes, doing the hard work to carry out, to make sure that all those details, because I can tell you all day long that this is coming, we need to be doing this innovation, we need to be growing in this way. And then those people that typically can live in that world can't pull back and all of a sudden say, now we need to get to put our nose to the grindstone and keep working as hard as we can to carry this out. So I do think we have to see seasons within organizations, within communities, that we have a period of innovation followed by, I'm going to get in the weeds and do this work and make sure and see it carry through. I think Allison's example of middle wave is a good example. Like, we can sit there and say, we want this to be grander, bigger, we want to be doing these things. And then somebody says, yeah, but what about, and those are the people, whether we call them dream crushers, I feel like there's, that you're saying, they're saying, you can't do this because of this. And you're like, oh, but and it becomes a person, like they're not real, that you're like, well, this person's being difficult, but really it's like, you need all those different people to see change. And if you constantly lived in a state of innovation, if our community did, we'd never really be solving for some of these big issues. We would be continually moving on to the next thing and not fully seeing that through. And so I do think there's an opportunity for big change. I mean, going back to the YWCA and what Paul is doing, I think there's an opportunity to live in this big world and simultaneously be solving for an issue that we didn't traditionally see them. We see them solving for the after effects, but it's not running up the river. That might happen out of some of these big ideas that can over time completely change our community.
We call those people accountants, Leslie.
Right. That's correct. Yeah.
And when you meet one who's really good at their job, you're like, you are in the right seat. And like, right. Zach, when you're asking the question, like, is there a point where we would say, no, this person is uniquely gifted to be in this seat at this time? I do think timing is important, but I don't know anyone who is more fully an architect in the thought and design space, like both of those, right, than you are. So I think Zach's in the right seat for how he is uniquely gifted. As an organization, I'm not sure you often have an opportunity to find that person who's uniquely gifted to sit in that seat, though. I think you also have to recognize, I guess, a lot of this, like the legitimacy and everyone has value and the idea of trust comes from the abundance mentality, right? That it's a both and. So the example I'm going to share comes from an abundance mentality to say, you can only be in that spot to think about that right person for that next seat without recognizing everything that has come before, not as an instead of, but as a because of, we've gotten to this point, right? The Community Foundation was searching for our next president and CEO. I don't know that we would have fully been able to articulate what we needed to have happen in the future, because of someone's retirement, but like Brad in the seat that he's in right now is uniquely talented and skilled for the work that the foundation is doing right now. There's just no question about it. And I think he, that person in that role is loving it as well. I don't know. I just keep thinking about it in an ecosystem. it's also helpful and, you know, life-giving to the person in the work as well.
And I was thinking, just piggyback off of all of these, of, you know, does the organization need to change in order to, or adapt for the person or the skill set or something like that? So on a very personal level, you know, for about a year, I was saying that I did not feel like I was a good executive director. I loved being a founder. But as things kind of went along, it was like, you know, I don't have the personality, the skill sets, whatever, for this next stage of organization growth. And, you know, it took a major wake-up call, you know, for me to realize, hey, this is not, you know, there needs to be a major shakeup on a personal level, which included a job change, but and a relocation. But I don't know, you know, if you rewind a year ago to say, all right, you should go, you know, be the development director and kind of special projects person, I don't know if I would have let go of the ED role, right? And so it's like, you know, thinking about Zach being kind of the idea and the architect, it's like, you know, here's a position, you know, within MKM that Zach can continue to grow in, and that's kind of a space that fits for the firm and for him personally. And again, this is just a real-time character, or not character analysis, but you know, the role of founder, that's a one-time thing, right? I mean, that's a one position for a given amount of time, and then once, you know, there won't be another founder of an organization. But I don't know where I was going with this. I'm an external processor. Where was I going with that? I don't know. There's something there. But the idea of positions changing, and also like there's something else like Allison brought up or the dishes and the role of like the community foundation of like, you know, even the thought of like smaller grants, you know, a smaller, you know, $1,000 or $2,500 for someone doing the dishes is absolutely game changing to kind of give them the space to think and process, versus a $2,500 gift to a $10 million a year organization. It doesn't even register, you know. And so it's you know, looking at people and organizations in power to say, you know, how can we start to move the needle on these things? Like, yes, those larger institutions still need our support, but those smaller dollars can it can really be the seeds for something quite important.
Well, I know this group could talk about this all day, but I promise we'd keep this to an hour. So my favorite part about this group of essays was, by complete accident, I think there's a lot of overlapping concerns or considerations about just how our community is processing things like risk and innovation and fear, largely probably through this idea of legitimacy in some shape or form. I think the question is understanding how to identify and maybe even teach it in a little bit better way so that we can get better at this and dispel this, well, I guess, growing perception of mistrust in our community. So I want to thank you guys too for everything. I know this has been a long project, and you all had day jobs and did this because you were interested, not because of it adding any other value than sit in the room and write something interesting. So I really thank you for doing that. And yeah, it meant a lot for you guys to participate in this. So thank you for that. Thank you for this. And we'll have this discussion again soon.